Okay, so welcome everyone. In today's lecture, we'll be discussing chapter 16, which deals with sex, gender, and personality. So, this thing moves. I guess before we get started, just as a disclaimer, or to make a note of when we talk about sex in this chapter, we're talking about um, biological, reproductive anatomy. When we're talking about gender, we're talking about a social construct of essentially what it means to be a woman or to be a man. This chapter in your textbook does not deal with any shades of gray between man and woman when it comes to gender, or male or female when it comes to sex. So it's a cisgender and binary approach to both sex and gender. And I'll say that's not necessarily by design, in terms of the textbook material. It's just when it comes to personality research, a lot of this research is pretty old. As we've seen, a lot of it has stood the test of time. But interest in, let's say, there's always interest in transgender individuals in the sex and gender fields. When it comes to, say, the field of psychology, it's transgenderism and the experience of transgender individuals is an up and coming topic. One of the issues that we run into in psychology in terms of studying transgender individuals is that transgender people make up a pretty small percentage of the population, depending on what source you're looking at. Generally accepted estimate is less than half of 1%. So when we do psychological research, we need decently large sample sizes to be able to make generalizations. And that research is happening. It's definitely taking place. It's slow to take place. Some of that is political. Research requires funding, and most funding comes from government agencies. So there are nonprofit organizations, but the big research projects are funded by government grants, and there's some reluctance to study transgender individuals and transgenderism. So that research is slow to be done because of lack of funding and resources. Like I said, there are plenty of studies that have been done, that are underway, but they're not going to find their way into a textbook anytime soon. It's probably going to be another few years or several years. By the time research makes it into a textbook, just by the nature of being a textbook, that research is going to be fairly old, because it has to be pretty established to make it into a textbook. We're not talking about individual journal articles here. If this were an upper level class, a seminar class, we would be looking at individual journal articles. But we're working through a textbook. We're working through what is essentially established phenomena, established findings in the field, and that's going to take some time. So the good news is that that research is happening, and you can certainly search PsycInfo for those studies if you want to do some independent readings on your own. So I just wanted to put that out there. So I'll be talking about sex and talking about gender, and just understand that I'm talking about cisgenderism and talking about both of these concepts, or sex and gender, as binary, not as existing on a continuum, because that's what the research is referring to in this chapter. Okay, well, that being said, brings us to the first point of why I even needed to make that disclaimer, is that the study of sex differences is very controversial. Study of gender is very controversial. The nature of gender is controversial, particularly now because of transgender, say, activism, or transgender individuals becoming more visible and more vocal in terms of wanting equal rights and wanting representation. So some of we'll see, well, I'm not sure if I want to get into some of the politics for this chapter, but if you take human sexuality with me, we definitely do talk about how transgender activists and some of the second wave feminist activists have been butting heads for several years now, and you would think that they would be natural allies, right? But it's all rooted in what is sex, and particularly what is gender. So there's a lot of controversy, surrounding these terms. I don't shy away from controversy at all, right? So I do study sexuality and gender and race, particularly when it comes to psych and law. I'm not interested in sexuality or gender as they exist as concepts or as constructs. More interested in how people view these terms, and how people create stereotypes and biases and prejudices on them. So not part of this. I don't think there's anything controversial about my research. Some people might think so, but it's more once we start getting into the philosophical notions of gender that we get into some pretty heated controversies. But the study of sex differences in general is controversial. Why? Well, because some people worry that findings of sex differences might be used to support certain political agendas or to uphold the status quo, which by and large is a male-dominated society, or a male-dominated status quo. And a number of feminist movements have been chipping away at that, and women are making strides in terms of equality in the workforce and in the political arena, but there's still quite a ways to go. That being said, we'll see throughout this chapter that there's gender advantages and disadvantages for men and women, and sex advantages and disadvantages for males and females as well. But by and large, where the research shows we're kind of in a male dominated society, though it's getting less so there. So some arguments that get made are that findings of sex differences merely reflect gender stereotypes rather than real differences. Also, that any discovery of sex differences merely reflects biases of scientists rather than objective descriptions of reality. Now, let's take a look at some of that. We spent quite a bit of time talking about research methods that are used in science. If you've taken 221, 222, you know that the scientific method, and scientists try very hard to remove bias and to be as objective as possible. But of course, we're all human, so I'm not sure that's going to be 100% possible. But it's a pretty bold statement to say that any discovery of sex differences is merely just bias among scientists. I don't like anti-science type of rhetoric, and that one kind of sounds anti-science to me. First argument, well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly research to support that, but let's take a look at some of the research that doesn't support that as well. But continuing along with some of the politics that are involved in studying sex and gender, is that some people will advocate that stopping research on sex, that we should stop research on sex differences, as the findings might conflict with the ideas of egalitarianism. If we find that there are, say, quote-unquote, real sex differences, this might, say, give one sex an advantage over the other when it comes to access to resources, or when it comes to equal rights and whatnot. Others will argue that scientific psychology and social change will be impossible until we actually come to terms with the real sex differences that do exist. So let's take a look. There are some sex differences out there. Let's see what they are, and let's see, how much they matter in a sense. So just briefly, we'll talk about the study of sex differences. Prior to 1973, your book says that little attention was paid to sex differences, and that's by and large true. Even though I would say there were still tons of studies that existed that examined differences between the sexes. However, there wasn't, let's say, they tended to be small studies, tended to have small samples, maybe not very comprehensive. It wasn't really until 1974 with McCoby and Jacqueline's book the psychology of sex differences that um, that the field or the domain of studying sex differences really came about and became, like, say, bubbled to the surface, came to the forefront of sorts in psychology. These researchers used a meta-analysis approach to examine the results of all the studies that had been published on sex differences. And that's essentially what a meta-analysis does. It takes all the studies that you get a hold of, all the relevant ones at least, and analyzes them as one, right? So one thing that we have already seen in psychology is that for every 5 studies that says this exists, I could pull up 5 that says it doesn't, right? So how do you make sense of the contradictory types of research or findings that we have in psychology often? Well, it's done through meta-analyses, where we actually take each of those studies, take a look at their results, we convert them to effect sizes, essentially, which basically says, okay, if you found an effect there, well, how strong was this effect, right? And then we kind of take, if we're, have all these different studies that are measuring all these different sex differences, we're able to kind of standardize them so that we're able to compare across studies, right? We're able to compare these studies all together through a meta-analysis. And that's exactly what Makobi and Jacqueline did. They, by reviewing hundreds of these or hundreds of these studies that showed several key conclusions about men and women and how males and females differed, they concluded that women were slightly better than men at verbal ability, and that men were slightly better women in mathematical ability, particularly visual mathematical stuff. So like geometry, visual rotation of objects, things like that. So spatial ability, maybe some mathematical reasoning. However, when it comes to personality characteristics, they concluded that the only sex difference that existed was aggression, and that it was men or males tended to show or tended to be more aggressive on average than females. So when it comes to even those mathematical, well, let's hold off on the sizes of these differences for a second here. So when it comes to, let's say, ability or intellect, whatever we want to call those initial findings, females tend to be slightly better with verbal tasks, and men tend to be slightly better when it comes to mathematical reasoning and spatial tasks. That's what this meta-analysis found. When it came to personality differences, really the only difference was that males tend to be more aggressive. So when it comes to meta-analyses, as I said, the name of the game is to take a bunch of studies here, take these apples, oranges, peaches, and bananas, and kind of, instead of comparing all these different things, convert them all into one thing, convert them all into tangerines, and then you can study them all. You can compare them all directly. And we do that through effect size, calculating effect sizes. So across these different studies that show sex differences, we're able to calculate, well, how big are these sex differences that we're talking about here. So effect size, or in this case, the D statistics, the Cohen's D, it's used to express the difference in standard deviations. So how far apart are males and females on this particular trait, let's say, or on this particular ability in this study here. So effect size can be calculated for each study of sex differences, and then averaged across studies to give an objective assessment of what's the overall or the average size of these types of differences. Well, let's just, before we start delving into the results, take a look at how we would interpret different effect sizes. So 0.2, we would consider this to be a pretty small effect size, or small difference. 0.5, we're talking about a medium difference, medium effect size. And 0.8 would be considered a large difference. So if you have already learned about correlation coefficients, and this is pretty much, well, correlation is an effect. R is an effect size measure. So we kind of interpret these effect sizes the same way that we do with correlation. Of course, the difference is that Cohen's D, the effect size that we're talking about here, is not bound by -1 and +1. Correlation, we know, can only range from -1 to +1, but Cohen's D can go above 1. So a positive effect size means that men would score higher than women, and a negative effect size, or negative D value, means that women score higher than men. Okay, so just keep this in mind as we move forward. So even the large effect size for the average sex difference does not necessarily have any implications for a particular individual. So this is important to realize and to keep in mind. We're only going to be talking about generalities here. Even if the sex differences are large, they exist only when we're talking about thousands and thousands of people, right? Not any two individuals. Just pulling a random male and a random female, you're not necessarily going to find that any difference. But even if you did, it might not necessarily be as strong as the differences that we're going to find when we're talking about these massive samples with tons of participants in it. Okay, so when it comes to those who describe sex differences as small and inconsequential, these are people who take the minimalist position, and I would put myself in this category. Is that, yeah, there are some established sex differences that, you know, we can't deny, because we're not flat earthers, right? We believe in science. But these differences tend to be small and inconsequential, meaning kind of meaningless in the grand scheme of things, for most of them anyway. So minimalists, we believe these are small differences that are essentially meaningless. And like I said, minimalists will offer two arguments. The first is that empirically, most findings of sex differences show small effect sizes. Second is that whatever differences that do exist don't really have much practical importance when it comes to behaviors or potential or personality or achievements in everyday life, in just normal life. That most of these sex differences we find in that are already small, we find them in laboratory settings. They're not really externally valid. They don't necessarily generalize to the real world, let's say. Okay, so those who take the maximalist position tend to argue that the magnitude of sex differences is comparable to the magnitude of many other effects in psychology, and that we shouldn't trivialize these effects, right? Typically when we deal with effects in psychology, the effect sizes are pretty small. Why? Well, because there's so much individual differences that exists between humans. So again, that's one of the reasons we're often criticized for being quote unquote a soft science, is that we can't get those big effect sizes that chemists or physicists can get, because they're dealing with chemicals that behave predictably in certain ways all the time. Every time you mix those two chemicals, you're going to get that reaction. That humans are way too complicated than just two chemicals, right? I mean, that's why I say we're much harder science, right? Trying to understand these things. So maximalists do have a point there, is that we tend to deal with small effect sizes in psychology in general. And small effect sizes can have important consequences. So even, effect sizes that might be small, in the long run, they can be meaningful. So, for example, if we found that women are just more empathic, they're just more likely to help somebody than men. Even if that's just a small difference, even if there's just a small difference in helping behaviors, over the course of a woman's life, say adult life, right, when she would be able to help people, I mean, that could translate into hundreds or thousands of more people that she's helped than a man, right? Again, I'm taking generally speaking and applying it to an individual, which I just told you not to do. But I'm just using this as to illustrate the point that someone who takes a maximalist position would have, is that even small differences, they build up over time to be quite meaningful, right? I'm saying, okay, I can understand that position there. Okay, so when it comes to sex differences in personality, what we see in the current research, when it comes to, we'll talk about the big 5 personality traits here. Extroversion, women score slightly higher on gregariousness, so they tend to be a little bit more outgoing, a little bit more friendly than men. Men score slightly higher on activity level. So when it comes to, remember, extroversion, it's not only about being, say, quote-unquote, a people person. It's about being more, let's say, people-oriented. Gregariousness is kindness and friendliness. But part of extroversion is also getting out there and doing stuff. So there's an activity component that doesn't necessarily involve other people per se. But men will score slightly higher on this activity level concerning extroversion, and men score moderately higher on assertiveness. Now, we're going to talk about where some of these differences might come from here, because I'm sure many of you, for that last one there, men scoring moderately higher on assertiveness, well, might that not be because men are taught or it's expected for us to be more assertive? Or rather, it's, let's say, the opposite, is that women are taught or expected to be less assertive. So we haven't yet gotten to what's causing these sex differences yet, but we'll get there. When it comes to agreeableness, women are more trusting and tender-minded than men. Again, we're talking about pretty small effect sizes here. Women will typically smile more than men, but this may suggest submissiveness and lower status rather than agreeableness. Again, a potential social explanation, right? Or societal explanation, or expectation for this particular finding here. Also, keep in mind what I said earlier, is that a lot of this research is several years old, and gender roles are changing. Gender expectations are changing. So, some of the newer research might show even smaller effect sizes here. Aggressiveness. So we even saw with the big meta-analysis that was done in 1974 that kind of brought sex differences, or the study of sex differences, that brought it into fashion, let's say, showed that this was the only personality difference that existed between the sexes. So this tends to be a pretty stable finding when it comes to aggressiveness, that men are more physically aggressive. It's noticed in personality tests. So as we give personality tests to men, they score as being more aggressive. It's noticed in fantasies, in men's fantasies, when it comes to interpersonal interactions, even sexual fantasies. There's a noticeable difference in level of aggression, and also in manifest behavior, in the way that men act, the way that they behave, is more aggressive than women. And effect sizes are the largest in the TAT and the smallest for self-report measures of aggression. But we studied, well, we talked about that TAT, this test. This is a projective test, right? So in this sense, we can kind of, well, we spoke about the validity of these projective tests, and how my opinion is that take them with a grain of salt there. But when it comes to this idea of them of aggression being the smallest in self-report measures, that makes total sense, right? That's just pure social desirability there. Aggressiveness is not necessarily seen as a socially desirable trait to have. No, I don't know if that's true. Let's put an asterisk next to that statement there. But if you were to ask a person who is aggressive if they are aggressive, chances are they're going to kind of downplay their aggressiveness. So when it comes to, say, these differences in aggression, they can have profound consequences for everyday life. Worldwide, men commit 90% of homicides, right? So there's clear sex difference there. Homicide, I would say, is the most extreme form of aggressiveness. There's different forms of aggression, right? But 90% of homicides is that's pretty significant. Men also commit more violent crimes of any kind, not just homicide, just violent crimes in general. And sex differences in violent crimes tends to accompany puberty. So this difference between males and females when it comes to violent crimes tends to peak in adolescence and early adulthood, or early 20s. By the time you're finished with your college degree, we start seeing the differences in aggression between the sexes become smaller and smaller. So they tend to peak during this say late teens, early adulthood age, which corresponds with what evolutionary theory, which we'll see in a moment here, would say is kind of really the time when men would be looking for mates, right? This is prime sexual reproduction time for males. So that aggression is fueled by potentially hormones and also evolutionary factors. Basically, this aggressiveness led to more mating opportunities to essentially pass down those aggressive genes, or we could think of in that sense aggression as being beneficial for sexual selection, let's say. Some other personality or sex differences in personality. Women score slightly higher on order when it comes to conscientiousness. So they score slightly higher on wanting things to let's say have order, to be neater, let's say. When it comes to emotional stability, women score moderately lower than men. So when we talk about emotional stability, we're not necessarily talking about mood swings here. We're talking about let's say, the level of which people will experience certain moods. So when you're happy, you're very happy, or when you're sad, you're very sad, or sadder, let's say, in this case, than men. So men will be more emotionally stable, more kind of like numb has a negative connotation to it. But we talked about emotional stability, so hopefully I don't need to trying to like make sure I'm not bashing anybody here. We know what emotional stability refers to. And open to experience, we don't see any sex differences there, not even small ones. So, again, taking a look at some of this stuff, my social psychologist brain and training is like kicking in. I'm saying, I don't know, pretty sure like boys are kind of taught to be emotionally stable, meaning like we're not supposed to express any of that. That's why we have shorter lifespans, right? And die of heart attacks and stuff, because we keep all that emotional stuff in. Conscientiousness, like the idea of order and whatnot. Young boys were kind of taught from a younger age, like, well, boys will be boys. We're sloppy. I see even some commercials sometimes on TV if I'm watching the news or whatever. There was one commercial. It's like a Febreze commercial or something. And it's like this teenage kid guy playing sports or whatever. His mom walks into the room and he's got like a messy room. His sports clothes all over the place, and she's kind of like, oh yeah, it smells like a teenage boy in here. How gross is that? And it's like, I'm like, oh, is this like helpful? It's kind of like stereotypical, number one. And it's also kind of like, it's like, oh, don't worry, mom's gonna come in here with Febreze and like just spray the fucking shit down so it doesn't stink anymore. And I'm like, alright, maybe some of that's true, but how much of that's like a self-fulfilling prophecy? If you're like, boys leaving their crap all over the place, and it's like, yeah, well, boys will be boys, and it's kind of like, I don't know, I'm pretty sure that commercial kind of just made my point, but that's just one commercial there. Okay, when it comes to the issue of self-esteem, self-esteem is a topic studied a lot in psychology, particularly clinical psychology and social psychology. Your textbook talks about the results from meta-analyses. So across ages, the effect size is pretty small in terms of differences in self-esteem, but males will score higher on self-esteem measures. Again, it's a small effect size. However, between the ages of 11 and 18, this gap, this difference tends to widen, or becomes larger. But it closes again, or becomes closer or smaller again, between the ages of 19 and 59, in these meta-analyses. So, at least during adolescent years, young males will have a higher self-esteem. The effect size of the self-esteem difference will be larger during this period of time, and then after 18, going into early adulthood, these differences, sex differences, become smaller again. The effect size becomes much smaller again. Okay, when it comes to sexuality, there are large differences in the interest in casual sex and the number of lifetime sex partners desired. Again, this is an issue that I tend to approach from a social psychological perspective here. I'm pretty sure we're gonna talk more about this a little later in the chapter here. I'm just trying to remember if I should speak about this stuff now or if I should wait. Let me wait, and if for some reason I didn't go further into differences, the sex differences when it comes to sexuality, I'll definitely mention those once I see an appropriate spot. Likely once we get to evolutionary theory in here. So when it comes to sexuality, again, tends to be large differences where males will prefer or have more interest in casual sex than females, and males will prefer or will report a larger number of desired sexual partners or lifetime sexual partners. The people things dimension. So, okay, vocational interests. Men tend to score more towards the things end of the people things dimension. Well, I guess we should mention what that is. When we talk about vocations, jobs that people choose, there are jobs that deal with focusing more on people, and there are jobs that focus more on doing things or working with things, objects, right? So again, men will tend to move or gravitate towards jobs that are more concerned with objects and dealing with things, and women will tend to score on these types of vocational tests. They'll tend to score more towards the people end of the spectrum. So, like being part of the helping professions, things like social work, or education, being a teacher, things like that. Actually working with people rather than working machines or computers or whatnot. Sex differences in depression. So in childhood, there doesn't seem to be any sex differences when it comes to depression. After puberty, women show depression at twice the rate that men do. And there's at least one explanation as to why that might be the case. This is a cognitive explanation that deals with rumination. So rumination is when we repeatedly focus on our problems and focus on what we did wrong and what we should have done better. We just constantly thinking about these things. Research suggests that women tend to ruminate more, which contributes to the perseverance of depressive symptoms. Rumination can definitely lead to not feeling so great, because when we ruminate, we're tending to focus on bad things that happen to us, or bad things that we've done, right? Rumination has a negative connotation to it. When it comes to, say, the sex differences in depression, the largest difference is between the ages of 18 and 44. After that, the sexes start to converge again. So we see childhood, no real difference. When it comes to sex differences in depression, and 18 to 44, women will report depression or depressive symptoms at twice the rate of men. And after 44, those sex differences start to close back up. Again, I can't help myself. I'm coming from a social, psychological perspective here. Again, men, we're not really taught to express ourselves, right? We're not really taught to be in touch with our feelings, in touch with our emotions. We're taught to suppress those things. Also, we're, taught, I mean, it's getting better, at least when it comes to the stigma of mental illness. We're getting better in that regard. But depression was often seen as a weakness, right? So a man who is depressed, I'm not sure if men would be so willing to admit that. Remember where a lot of these results come from self-reports, right? And also when it comes to, say, depression for men, a lot of times feelings of depression actually are expressed as aggression, or men are more likely to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. And it kind of makes sense. The research shows that when it comes to alcoholism, men are about twice as likely to develop alcoholism than women, or drug addiction than women. And women are twice likely to develop depression. So I don't know. Maybe it's not really a sex difference in depression. Maybe it's a sex difference in how that depression is being experienced, or how it's manifesting, right? So there's a couple ways to look at this data. Like I said, we're just going through some of the major findings here. We'll talk about some explanations in a bit. Okay, so the notion of masculinity, femininity, androgyny, and sex roles. So in the 1930s, researchers assumed that sex differences on various personality items were attributable to differences along the single dimension of masculinity and femininity, right? So we know this continuum here, where certain traits are associated as being masculine, certain traits are associated as being feminine, and masculinity being associated with, the concept of man, right, of being a man, and femininity being associated with the concept, I say concept because we kind of just made this stuff up, of being a woman, right? So what traits are feminine? Society determines that. What traits are masculine? Society determines that. So nobody is 100%. I could give you one of these tests, one of these inventories, and everybody's got both masculine and feminine traits. And even the researchers in the 30s recognized this. That's why they call it a dimension of masculinity and femininity. We got a combination of both of these in there. But perhaps someone could score high on both masculinity and femininity. So that kind of caused a little bit of a conundrum there, because we thought this was just a single dimension, right? It was a continuum, so there's masculinity and femininity on either end, and all of us are somewhere in between there. Nobody's, like I said, on either side completely, but we're somewhere in between, except that they were finding that, people were actually scoring high on both the masculine and on the feminine traits. And this led to the concept of androgyny, basically having both masculine and feminine traits at a high, scoring high on both of these these traits. So in the early 1970s, researchers challenged the assumption of this single dimension of essentially gender roles, right, or gender traits, and they began arguing that masculinity and femininity might be actually independent and separable. So that they're not actually a continuum, they're actually two separate traits, right? So it's not just a trait that exists on a continuum, but they're actually two separate traits. You could be high and low on each of these things. So two new measures were developed to assess these two dimensions that are now assumed to be independent. So those who score high on both dimensions were labeled androgynous to reflect the notion that a person could have both masculine and feminine characteristics, to be high on both masculine and feminine characteristics. Researchers who developed the instruments viewed the androgynous person as the most highly developed. So in this case, these were almost, we could think of them as like the self-actualizers in a sense. So androgyny, even to this day, androgyny is still, well, maybe not to this day, but up until recent times, androgyny still had a respectability to it, a coolness to it, for lack of a better word. I mean, you just take a look at the 1970s rock bands, right, and the 1980s glam rock bands, and the whole androgyny fashion and music scene associated with the new wave movement in the 1980s, even going into the 90s a bit. But then I think androgyny kind of fell off. Except that we did start seeing a little emergence of, say, like the metrosexual that came back. Not quite androgyny, right? Still, see, the 90s were very strange. And again, coming at it from a psychological, but also like a musical perspective. Let's take a look at all those hair bands of the 80s, right? All these like rockers who kind of like, they were completely androgynous. They looked like women. They looked like how my sisters did their hair and makeup in the 80s. And they were singing all these songs about, like, you know, all these really misogynistic songs about women and stuff. And I'm like, whoa, that's like total glam rock. They called it heavy metal. Definitely nothing heavy metal. It was like pop rock type of stuff. And then the 90s, when you had the grunge movement, kind of was like a rejection of all that. You know, guys like didn't wash their hair and grew out their facial stubble and wore, you know, flannel shirts and torn jeans and stuff. But at the same time, the music of the 90s, even though it was like the aesthetic was becoming more masculine, the music was all about, you know, like feminism and equal rights, and even like, you know, gay rights and all that stuff. So it's just strange how that worked. But I won't go off on a tangent. This is a pretty long chapter, so I want to make sure that we get through it here. But yeah, I mean, even just from a pop culture perspective, you can kind of see that androgynous people tend to be pretty well respected in culture, and researchers certainly saw androgynous people to be the most developed. I mean, they have the best of both worlds, right? The best of both characteristics, male and female, or masculine and feminine. So, many people, however, criticize the new measures and the underlying ideas that the underlying ideas that masculinity and femininity were somehow separate dimensions. So contrary to researchers' assumptions, both constructs are actually multi-dimensional and contain many facets. And several studies documented that masculinity and femininity describe a single bipolar trait, that they're actually not independent, right? So who the hell knows? There's still quite a bit of research to be done, again, in the notion of gender, but it comes, again, I don't want to get too political here, but a lot of gender research can be political in nature, for better or worse, right? As the psychological scientists, politics and research shouldn't have anything to do with each other, but I'm a realist. I understand, of course, everything can be used for political purposes. I'm a researcher. I'm not a theorist, so I don't have anything vested in these, in upholding a particular theory or a particular point of view. If I believe something and the research suggests that I'm wrong, then I'm going to change my beliefs, right? Of course, that's easier said than done, because, as I was saying before, we have second wave feminism, also known as radical feminism, and some transgender activists, not all transgender activism and radical feminism butt heads, but its problem causes a lot of infighting between, again, two groups that you would imagine or would hope would share the same values. And I'm not saying that they don't share the same values, but they're approaching gender and even sex from different perspectives. Radical feminism sees gender as being completely fake, completely made up. None of this shit is real, right? We all made this stuff up. Well, trans people, or trans activists more specifically, would say, well, no, that's not true, because I knew that I was not, what I was labeled at birth. I knew that for the longest time, right? So there has to be something more than just a social construct to this stuff. And there's a whole bunch of, issues that cause contention between the two groups, but that's kind of what it boils down to, is that radical feminists have for the longest time been fighting to get rid of the notion of gender and get rid of gender roles and this idea that, males and females are different somehow. But trans people would say, well, then that invalidates our existence, right? Because I'm, a different gender than what my body or what I was assigned as at birth. Like in here, I'm a different gender. So, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, it's I see that as kind of as growing pains that exist within the same community who share the same interests. It's, sometimes there's some infighting and some growing pains again, but eventually there'll be a resolution. But the fact of the matter is, there's so many. I mean, like the concept of male, or the concept of woman and men, or masculinity and femininity. Uh, as a psychologist, I'm pretty sure, it's society, and there might be some biological component. It's always nature and nurture, right? It's almost never just one, explanation for anything, in our field, which can be frustrating, right? Because we're not sure which one is contributing more, right? Just, we know that humans are part of nature. We're animals. We're part of the animal world. We're part of nature. We also create societies and stupid ass rules that go along with it. So, yeah, we're dealing with both here, but it's not my battle to fight there. Okay, so researchers who constructed measures essentially changed their views. Spence, we see here, that said that the measure does not assess sex roles, but assesses personality traits of instrumentality and expressiveness instead. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, instrumentality consists of personality traits that involve working with objects, getting tasks completed in, let's say, a direct fashion, showing independence from others, and displaying self-sufficiency. Expressiveness is the ease with which one can express emotions, such as crying and showing empathy for other people, and showing nurturance to those who are in need. So essentially, Spence said, yeah, they're not necessarily sex roles; they're actually personality traits, right? The masculine, what we called masculinity, is really just instrumentality, and what we called femininity is really just expressiveness. These are personality traits. Bem, who is a pretty prominent sex and gender researcher, said that the measures assess gender schemata, or cognitive orientations, that lead people to process social information on the basis of sex-linked associations. What does that mean? Well, he basically says Ben is like a cognitive social psychologist here, said that we develop these gender schemata, or ways of seeing the world, that we basically develop these worldviews that tend to be gendered, right? It's like what he called cognitive orientations. And it's through these schemata that we process the world that's around us, that we process the information that's around us. And much of this information is linked to sex and sex roles, or what we would call gender roles now. So essentially, we're kind of processing the world through gendered goggles, right, or gendered glasses, in a sense. When it comes to gender stereotypes are unique, or they're different than other types of stereotypes, right? Because most stereotypes, quote unquote, explain people. They're explanatory. So, you know, we could go through a list. There's tons of stereotypes about every group of people that exists out there, right? But they are descriptive. So, like I said, Irish heritage. So we all know clear stereotype, or common stereotype, is that the Irish are all drunks. I say not all of us, just most of us. I kid, of course. But yeah, that's describing the Irish, so to speak. But gender stereotypes aren't descriptive. They're what we call proscriptive. They don't describe how men and women are. They tell us how men and women should be, right? So in a sense, gender stereotypes are kind of gender roles or gender expectations, in a sense. It's not a well, it's a stereotype, but it's not necessarily a description to say that, you know, women are nurturing. It's a stereotype, right? Clearly, not all women are nurturing. You haven't met my mother. But it's saying women are supposed to be nurturing. Women should be nurturing, right? When it comes to all stereotypes, not just gender stereotypes, we have cognitive, the ABCs of stereotypes, what we could say. These are not in the right order here to make my ABCs of stereotypes mnemonic device useful, but there's a cognitive component to stereotypes, an affective component, and a behavioral component, right? So what we think of people, what we feel about people, how we behave towards people. This can, these are the different components that go into stereotyping and gender stereotyping for our purposes. So although there are some variations from culture to culture, it's pretty remarkable that the content of these gender stereotypes, the different attributes that we believe men and women should possess, tend to be highly similar across cultures. So we'll see why that might be the case in a moment here. But these gender stereotypes tend to be pretty universal, in a sense. So the content of gender stereotypes, again, these are attributes we believe men and women possess, but not just that attributes that they possess, but also attributes that they should possess, right? Men should act this way. Women should act that way. Nobody's really saying Irish people should be drunks, right? Also, we said that these stereotypes are similar across cultures. Example of this is that women are perceived as being more communal or more oriented towards the group, whereas men are perceived as being more instrumental, asserting independence from the group. This tends to be a stereotype seen across cultures. Okay, so stereotypic subtypes of men and women. Some people will argue that people don't hold a single gender stereotype, that there's actually different categories of men, or different categories of male and female stereotypes, right? That you have different stereotypical men and different stereotypical women, which we'll take a look at in a second here. When it comes to prejudice and gender stereotypes can have important real life consequences for both men and women. Gender roles are not good for anybody. I mean, it leads to many privileges for males in certain areas of society, but it's also detrimental for males in other parts of society. The same is true for women as well, right? When it comes to gender expectations and equal rights and equal pay, women suffer because of the stereotypes and the prejudice, the discrimination that comes with it. But women do benefit when it comes to the criminal justice system. That's for sure. And I know, I can speak to that just because that's my area. That's my area of research. The first thing that's coming to mind. Women tend to get way less punitive, or way less severe punishments in the criminal justice system than do men. Women got to avoid the draft for a very long time, right? I don't know if that's, let's say, well, that's definitely good. I would hope nobody would want to be drafted. I don't think anyone wants to be drafted. If you wanted to go to war, you would just sign up to go into the military. Draft means you don't want to go, but they're forcing you to go. When it comes to child custody issues, there's a bunch of areas. Again, gender stereotypes and gender roles don't do anybody any good, right? So these consequences again can damage people in their health, in their jobs, chances for advancement, social reputations. When people don't fit into their gender roles, right, into their stereotypes, you're punished for that, particularly males, right? So it's better, more acceptable in society to, let's say, be a tomboy than it is to be, quote unquote, a sissy. Why? Well, part of that is misogyny, is sexism, is that, it's people, the same goes with why lesbians tend to be more tolerated or more accepted than gay men. Again, because of sexism, right? It's that a sissy boy or a gay man is seen as acting like a woman. And that's disgraceful in our society because, you're a man. Why would you reduce yourself to act like a woman, right? People could understand why a woman might want to, quote unquote, act like a man, because that's where the power is. Like, who wouldn't want to be a man in our society? So a lot of these, a lot of these repercussions just come from bullshit gender roles that we make up, right? And that, again, this stuff is changing with time, but it's slow to change. But when it comes to even this issue, damage to people's health, yeah, men have a lower life expectancy because of the patriarchy, because of misogyny, because they're taught to like keep all this shit in. They're not supposed to cry or show emotions, or like even going to a therapist. Like, there's still guys who won't do that because it's weak, it's not manly or whatever. Okay, so what happens? Well, they'll die 10 years before their spouse, before their wives, or they'll develop alcoholism or drug addiction or something else, or we're taught to be aggressive and be dominant. They'll get involved in some aggressive or violent crimes and end up going to jail or getting killed, right? So there's a bunch of gender stuff doesn't do anybody any good, in my opinion here. Okay, so when it comes to, like I said, the notion of gender subtypes, this is a result, or this is summary, or a finding, or what would I call this? A diagram of what's known as a cluster analysis. So what does cluster analysis do? Well, it takes in our case, these different stereotypes that exist and kind of sees through statistical analyses which kind of traits of these stereotypes stick together or cluster together, right? So let's just say here, different male subtypes. Like I said, there's different stereotypes about men, or there might be different types of men, so to speak, based on stereotypes. So here's the, say, cluster A. What's hanging around in cluster A? It says gay, soft, quiet, philanthropist, right? So this seems like some type of cluster of a certain type of male. Then looks like we have another type of male, or type of man here, who's intellectual and confident. Looks like where's cluster B? Cluster B is the bureaucrat, the social climber, the career man, the manager type. Cluster C, this is the bourgeoisie, this is the elitist, the gentleman, so to speak. Where's cluster D? Cluster D, this is the playboy, the player, the ladies' man, right? Mr. Casual, the cool, slick guy. Cluster C, or cluster E, rather. Not sure exactly what the hell that one's. Ego cluster. Well, looks like some of these clusters are overlapping here. So we got the macho, machismo, flashy type of male. Let's see what some of the subtype, the different types of female clusters that appear. The career woman, cluster A, right? So intellectual, confident, lefty, liberal, feminist type career woman. Cluster B looks like the housewife type. So this is the mother. I'm just looking at the different traits associated with them. I'm thinking, what would I cluster this stuff as? Looks like the the housewife type, conformist, secretary, housewife, busy, maternal, housework maniac, so one who loves cooking, cleaning, and whatnot. Looks like third cluster, cluster C, the third type of stereotype of basically the whore, right? The vamp, the sex bomb, this is the flirty girl. So we see, according to who was it that said we had? I totally forgot who said that we have the subtypes. I didn't include their name. In the... Okay, I'm sorry. Take a look in your book. I forget the researchers who developed this model of gender subtypes. But there is actually, even just reading these out, right? We do have like the stereotypical career woman and housewife, and the hussy, and the soft, quiet type of guy, and the businessman, the manager type of male, and then we have like the ladies man type of stuff. So basically what those different subtypes of stereotypes are saying is like, yeah, there's different types of males and females that people can fall under. Okay, so here we go. What's causing these sex differences? It's going to tell you straight up, nobody knows. Okay, we're going to take a look at some theories here to try to explain some of these sex differences. We have the socialization and social roles theory. As you would imagine, I tend to gravitate more to those. But all of these, like I said, nobody knows, and we'll see some of these as we go through them all. They're all gonna be pretty reasonable explanations. I'll give you a heads up or a hint. They're all probably right. They're probably a combination of all of these things, right? So socialization and social roles, hormonal theories, evolutionary psychological theories, and an integrated theoretical perspective. So let's start with socialization and social roles. So socialization theory, as I have touched on in this chapter, and probably throughout this class, states that boys and girls become different because boys and girls are treated differently, right? Boys are reinforced by their parents and teachers and the media for being masculine, and girls are reinforced by their parents, their teachers, and the media for being feminine. The moment your parents know what's between your legs, before you even enter this world, as soon as they know what's between your legs, you're being treated differently, right? Once they see something on the sonogram, or they don't see something on the sonogram, that's going to determine what color clothes you're going to wear for how many years, what color walls are going to be in your nursery, what kind of toys are going to be waiting for you when you come back from the hospital, what name you're going to get, right? How long your hair is going to be. All of this stuff is determined the second somebody knows what's between your legs. And all of this stuff gets reinforced, again, by our parents, by our teachers, by our media. And what's missing from this statement here, by our peers. We reinforce these roles, right? You remember making fun of somebody who might have, been a little too masculine, a little too boyish, or a little too girlish? Or do you remember getting, picked on for being a little too boyish or a little too girlish, depending on, again, how you were supposed to be? Our peers, we reinforce this stuff ourselves here, right? So Bandura's social learning theory, if you haven't taken social psych, you'll definitely learn more about this in social psych, and I'm sure you've learned about this in intro to psych. But social learning theory states that we learn by watching others, right? We learn through our environment. So according to Bandura's theory, boys and girls learn by observing behaviors of others of their own sex. So we do what dad does, or we do what mom does, or we do what our boy friends are doing, and we do what our girlfriends are doing, so on and so forth. We learn like, oh, I'm a boy and he's a boy, so I guess I should be acting like that. So this is the crust of socialization, and basically gender is just social roles, right? That we kind of just make them up. To be fair criticism of something that largely subscribe to doesn't necessarily account for the universality of social roles across thousands of different cultures that exist. Gender roles tend to be pretty consistent, right? So there's likely something else going on along with this socialization. So some research supports socialization and social learning theories of sex differences. We know that across cultures, boys and girls are treated differently. That exists, right? Some problems here is that the simple theory that the causal arrow runs only one way, basically, parents to children or society to children, and that's open to question, right? It's like, there's definitely a association, there's definitely a relationship going on here, but is it causal or is it correlational? Like I said, that's fair criticism. Another problem is that there's no account for the origin of the sex differentiated socialization process. Where does it come from? Why are boys treated this way and girls treated that way? We don't really know. I guess my retort to that is, up until about 100 years ago, pink was for boys and blue was for girls, because pink was seen as a variation of red. Well, not seen. It is a variation of red. And red was associated with aggression and masculinity and war and blah, blah, blah. And blue associated with calmness and peacefulness. So somehow those got switched. The colors got switched. I mean, we have colors associated with, again, what's between our legs. Like, that makes no sense, right? I mean, some of this stuff we just make it up. we just make this shit up, some of it. At the same time, you know, the idea of pink being a variation of red, more suited for a young boy, but still associated with dominance and war and stuff. Okay, then it's still suggesting some gender differentiation that's not just, you know, totally made up, not just based on color. The color is representing something. But just the fact that it flipped. Now it's pink is for girls and blue is for boys. Where did that come from? Right? At least the other way around makes more sense. If you want to believe in those gender there. Okay. Social role theories say that sex differences arise as men and women are distributed differently into different occupational and family roles. So essentially, it was the division of labor. There were certain tasks that males would do, certain tasks that females would do, and this is where those sex differences came from. And certain tasks would be divided based on, say, sex, because our bodies are built differently. Men will have more muscle mass, stronger bone density than women. And of course, we know, women give birth, and humans. It's so crazy sometimes when you watch these animal kingdom shows and you watch animals giving birth, like a giraffe just standing there, and giraffe comes out, and baby giraffe just starts it takes it like a minute for it to catch its balance, and then starts walking and going along. Like, oh my god, what would the human race look like if that happened? Right? That doesn't happen. Human babies need a lot of attention, and you gotta carry that thing around for 9 months. It was only until pretty recently that, being pregnant, you had a pretty good chance of dying during childbirth, or the baby dying during childbirth. But then after it's born, that kid, it needs constant 24/7 supervision for years, in order for it to survive, right? So, of course, there's going to be a natural division of roles, because I don't know, the mom has to stay there and keep this thing alive by feeding it, literally, right? She is the source of food there. So, this idea of social role theories, that these sex differences arose from different tasks that were distributed. Again, some research supports this theory. Problem is that there's no account of the origin of sex differentiated roles, except I just kind of gave you a little bit of one. Some of it was just out of necessity of, male and female bodies are built differently. It's just fact of the matter, right? The way it is. Okay, so hormonal theories of sex differences. So hormonal and physiological differences will cause boys and girls to diverge over development. So according to these theories, boys and girls are going to be, relatively the same, no real sex differences. And then basically once puberty kicks in, then we're going to start seeing a lot more sex differences, or the development of sex differences here. So following puberty, there's no overlap in the level of circulating testosterone. So once puberty hits, men's testosterone levels are about 10 times that of women. So there are major changes that are going to happen during puberty. I guess my question here is, well, what about the sex differences that we see before puberty, right? Because we do see sex differences before puberty in terms of, say, the different activities that young boys and young girls are involved in, the way that they express or manifest aggression, right? The different types of social relationships and interactions that they engage in, their toy preference. Like, there's a bunch of sex differences that exist before this divergence caused by hormones. But clearly, 10 times more testosterone, that's going to lead to some differences here. Sex differences in testosterone are linked with traditional sex differences in behaviors such as aggression and dominance, career choice, and sexual desire. All of this stuff has been shown to be accurate. Career choice, somewhat, but definitely when it comes to aggression and sexual desire, testosterone, yep, yeah. I mean, take a look at trans people who are transitioning, say, going on testosterone, will tell you straight up, yeah, their sex drive is through the roof. Also, become much more agitated, much more aggressive. Testosterone is known to do that. And not just people transitioning, going on testosterone hormone replacement therapy, but just if you had to take, steroids for whatever medical reason, people will report increases in aggression and sexual desire. So the problem with, say, hormonal theories is that research suggests that the link between hormones and behaviors is bidirectional, and that there are no accounts of the origin of hormonal differences. So talk about bidirectional nature in a second here, but you see a running theme with the problem of all of these theories so far is that nobody knows how they began, right? So where's the origin of these hormonal differences? Right? When did this start happening? We don't know the cause or the kickoff point. But the other problem here is that, again, the link between hormones and behavior is bidirectional. You can have different level or influence the level of hormones circulating in your body based on certain behaviors. So having sex actually increases testosterone, in males at least, right? And in females as well. Engaging in sporting activities will increase testosterone levels. Gaining body fat in males and in females increases estrogen levels, right? So our behaviors and hormones is not just a one arrow directional causal relationship. Our behaviors also influence our hormones, and our hormones influence our behaviors. So it's not a complete explanation. None of these are a complete explanation. If you're starting to pick up a theme here, right? The evolutionary psychology theory says that the sexes are predicted, to differ only in those domains in which people are recurrently faced with different adaptive problems. So problems must be solved to survive and reproduce. So where does the evolutionary aspect come in? Well, I would say that these sex differences exist because they were adaptive. It was adaptive for males to become more aggressive because they were fighting for mates, or because they were primarily the hunters, or they were protecting the newborn and maybe their mate, right? So aggression is an evolutionary advantageous trait in males, let's say. Why would women become more nurturing, let's say, from an evolutionary perspective? Well, imagine I just gave you that whole spiel about, like human infants being really, really vulnerable and in a whole lot of trouble, completely dependent, for the first several years of their lives. You can imagine that nurturance would be kind of essential for a woman to have as a trait if she were to have children, right? Again, this is from an evolutionary perspective, is that nurturance or having empathy from a woman, for a woman to have these traits would be adaptive. It would make sure that their offspring would live on and then pass on those nurturing genes to their offspring, or the aggressive genes to their offspring, right? So research supports many of the predicted sex differences, particularly in sexuality. And I said, if I didn't mention it before, I mentioned it a little bit here. When it comes to evolutionary theory and human sexuality, this is a complicated topic here, and kind of controversial. You should take my human sexuality class. We go into this in much more detail. But it basically boils down to the saying that sperm is cheap and eggs are expensive. So what does that mean? Well, a woman only has a certain number of eggs, and she will only be fertile for a certain number of years, limited number of years, throughout her life. She also has to carry an infant for 9 months, risk dying by giving birth in what is widely considered, from what I've heard, don't have any personal experience with it, widely considered a pretty painful and unpleasant process of bringing life into this world. And then she's tasked with keeping this thing alive until it's able to feed itself and defend itself. According to evolutionary theory, she's not just gonna do this with any Joe Schmo out there. She's gonna try to find the best guy, the best mate, the best male, who's got the best genes, right? She's got a lot to invest if she's going to sleep with a guy and potentially get knocked up. this now becomes a whole life-changing situation for this woman. And again, I'm talking about our cave men and cave women and our cave ancestors here. From an evolutionary standpoint, yeah, eggs are expensive. There's a lot that goes into them. When it comes to sperm, guys are fertile to the day they die. I mean, not always, but yeah, still producing sperm. You can there's no menopause, even though there might be something akin to menopause, but sperm production slows down, but it doesn't stop. Also, when it comes to sperm, there's plenty of it. So, from an evolutionary perspective, if the name of the game is to pass on your genes, it would make sense for males to want to sleep with as many mates as possible in order to increase his chances of passing on those genes, right? So again, there's a lot of issues that come with that theory. It doesn't take into account historical perspectives or societal issues. It doesn't explain homosexual or bisexual sexual behaviors. It's a whole bunch of issues with that theory. However, a lot of the predictions that evolutionary psychology theory makes, particularly when it comes to sexuality, as we discussed, one of them being the number of desired lifetime partners. Men will report wanting more sexual partners than women typically do, and men seem to want more casual sex than women typically do. Again, so we're talking about generalities here, except some of the research some of the research being done now suggests that that's actually changing. It's actually changing quite a bit, which suggests that again society is playing a role here. Women are becoming more sexually liberated, and not just more sexually liberated, but being less ashamed of it. They're actually telling researchers what we kind of already knew, that men and women tend to have about the same number of sexual partners. Remember what I said, the difference is in the desired number of sexual partners. How many you want to have versus how many you actually have. Okay, so of course, beyond some of the social issues that the evolutionary theory raises, another problem is, once again, no clear accounting of individual differences and differences within each sex. How does evolutionary theory explain, the tons and tons of women out there who have higher sex drives than men do, right? That's just like one of so many individual differences that exist. Like, evolutionary theory can't explain that. It's either, this is how it is because this is how it works for our species, and this is what's in our DNA. Well, it can't only be that, right? Because we see so much variation that exists within each individual, and that exists within the sexes. So, brings me to the last perspective, is that it's probably some combination of all of these things, right? The integrated theory of sex differences would take all levels of analyses into account. So the socialization, hormonal perspective, the evolutionary perspective, because they're compatible with each other, and no theory explains everything. It's just, that's a fact, right? There's the best that we could do is say, one theory probably explains more of the variance than the other, but we don't really know that either, right? Like I said, one thing you'll have to probably get used to as being a psychologist when people ask you questions about like nature and nurture is say, yeah, both. And when they ask, well, how much of each? Who knows, right? We're still trying to figure that out. Not sure there's going to be an easy way, or if we're ever going to figure it out. Ultimately, is it important? Well, it depends, right? If you're take more of like the basic research approach, and you say, well, yeah, it's important because that's how we're going to understand human nature, and that's how we're really going to be able to be psychologists, is by understanding the roots of human behavior. I would say, okay, well then that might be important. If you take more of the applied approach, where it's, we want to understand human behavior because, and cognition and emotion, because we want to make life better for humans, then maybe it's not so important. But again, humans, we are part of nature. We are the result of evolution. No doubt that that helps explain some of our behaviors, emotions, our cognitions. We certainly have different levels of hormones, and we know hormones are related to these things. And we also, no doubt, see, high levels of gendered socialization all around us. So, again, let me see. I think I have some summary slides here. I just don't want to try to prevent myself from going off on a tangent. So to summarize what we spoke about, some sex differences are real and not artifacts of particular investigators or methods. So some sex differences do exist. They're not just the result of, say, some biased scientists there. Some sex differences are constant over generations and across cultures. The magnitude of sex differences varies greatly. However, the magnitude of sex differences are generally low. When we talk about effect sizes, we're not talking about, massive differences between the sexes here. When questions about sex differences are posed, the person must ask, in what domains? So essentially, that's another question you should probably, or another answer to keep in your repertoire. When we talk about sex differences, okay, yeah, in what domains? In personality, well, we see, some minor ones, big ones, when it comes to aggression. When it comes to, say, cognitive ability, maybe slight advantage for females when it comes to verbal tasks, maybe slight advantage for males when it comes to particularly spatial tasks. Small differences, but again, to be fair, some people will say, yeah, those small differences though can translate to meaningful things, meaningful events, and meaningful experiences over time, right? So domains that show larger sex differences include assertiveness, aggressiveness, interest in casual sex, but there's an overlap in each domain. So it's hard to really tease out stuff. Again, in the 1970s, we saw the rise and fall of the concept of androgyny. Even though I'm going to say the concept probably fell in the 80s there. And not just because of the change in pop culture, but research as well. Masculinity and femininity were found to be independent and are now termed instrumentality and expressiveness. Sometimes, if you do gender research, you'll still see the terms masculinity and femininity in the research, and also on these scales, the way that we measure these things. But this is a personality psychology class, so they've been renamed for purposes of describing personality traits. Cross-cultural work reveals some universality of gender stereotypes, which correspond in many ways to actual sex differences. So, yeah, when it comes to most stereotypes, there's the saying where there's smoke, there's fire is probably true. Most stereotypes probably come from a tiny inkling of truth somewhere down the line, right? And that's not what makes stereotypes a problem. Stereotypes are a problem when you try to apply this one generalization to an entire group of people. That's what makes stereotypes a problem. That's what makes stereotypes a stereotype. But the stereotype of Irish people are drunks. Why? Because they like to drink a lot. Yeah, that's true, actually, right? So, doesn't mean everybody is drunk, but number one export of Ireland is Guinness. So, and Jameson is probably second, close second in there. So we like our beverages. But how many cultures? There's so many cultures that are associated with being drunks, right? So again, some of the stuff gets silly after a while. Traditional theories of sex differences have emphasized social factors. So we have seen that, especially, say the 1970s when the second wave feminist movement, we had women's liberation. The 1970s also had the sexual liberation, but also what is often seen as kind of the second wave of LGBT, but less transgender, but mostly gay and lesbian liberation or gay and lesbian rights movements in the 1970s, which was basically cut short because of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s there. It's more recent theories in terms of regarding hormonal theories. These tend to be more recent theories, even evolutionary psychology, which has been around forever, and those theories have been around forever. They're just becoming more generally accepted. To my chagrin, social is not to my chagrin. Like I said, I'm fascinated with society and the workings of people and how we interact with each other. So I'll always have a special place for social psych. But social psych, we've adapted to we've taken in these theories. The research is what it is, right? You're not gonna reject science here, but I'm also not going to reject science from the social perspective either. So psychology is kind of emerging. Again, this integrative approach where it's called the biopsychosocial model of psychology. So biology, psychology, and social explanations are really what we should be looking at, all of these, and how they interact with one another. And then, last slide here, evolutionary psychologists argue that men and women differ in those domains in which they are recurrently confronted with sex-linked adaptive problems, particularly surrounding sexuality, mate selection, right? And finally, an integrative theory that includes social, psychological, and evolutionary levels of analysis is required. And we're moving in that direction. One thing that I will say, just on a closing note that's not here, is that just because something was beneficial to us in our evolutionary past doesn't mean that it's beneficial to us now that we live in a society with rules, right? Rules that we create in order to form a better life for ourselves. So yeah, from an evolutionary perspective, it's a good thing to go in and, if you take over a tribe, to go in, kill all the newborns and rape all the women to have your tribe genes, now spread. Not such a great idea in modern times, right? From a social, societal perspective here. So, we shouldn't argue that some of these things are just because they're quote unquote natural, are acceptable or good, right? The same with, say, hormones. It's one thing to understand the role that hormones might play in, say, aggression, but it should never be used as an excuse, because there's also plenty of things within our society and within our socialization that rewards aggression among males, at least, right? Take a look at sports and the money that's made in those areas, particularly the aggressive sports, which are most of the male sports. Okay, that's that. Those 2 hours there. That's not, I've done longer ones than this, so not too bad. Okay, I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.